This video is meant to give you some information about our next task that we're going to be taking on as we get ready to read A Christmas Carol. And what we're going to be covering today is the idea of what's called annotating, which is a very detailed form of note taking. And we're going to be using it to focus on some articles about the author of A Christmas Carol, named Charles Dickens. And what you'll have your choice of three articles that you'll have to read and be prepared to annotate and pull important information from as you uh, read these texts in the next several days. In order to annotate, there are four steps to annotating, and each one has a specific thing you do within the article when you are annotating it. The first one is circling. We circle keywords or phrases that might be confusing or unknown to us. The idea would be that helps us to identify the words that might be difficult for us, and therefore we could go and look those up, help deepen our understanding of the text, and make it easier for us to take information from the text if we know those unknown words. The second thing we would use is a question mark, and that represents questions, specific questions that you, the reader, have about something you've read during your interaction with the text. It could be a short question, 3 or 4 words. It could be a few words more than that. But it is something that you personally, as a reader, have a question about as you're reading the article. Another mark that we use in our annotating of articles is an exclamation mark. This is something that shows that we found something in our reading that was surprising to us, and not just putting the exclamation point, but also briefly describing what it was that was surprising to us about what we read. So we've got circling keywords that are confusing or unknown that we'd want to look up for better understanding. We have a question mark for places we have questions about in the text, exclamation mark for places where we find something surprising. And then the last one is using an arrow. And this arrow represents that we've read something that we're able to make a connection to with as a reader to something else that we've previously read on the topic that we're currently reading about. So if we're reading an article about Charles Dickens, so we might find something in a text that relates to maybe the packet on the Victorian era that we read and find a connection between the two. So those are the types of marks that we're going to be using. So I want to give you a brief look at how that goes. In order to properly annotate, you're going to need 4 different color or types of writing utensils. So for mine, I've gone with a black ink pen. I've gone with a purple pen. I've gone with just a regular old pencil and a blue ink pen. So blue, pencil, purple, and black. The first thing I'd want to do is once again remember what I'm doing with these. So I might say, all right, well, my key terms that I don't know, I'm going to use my pencil for those. And every time I come across a word or phrase I don't know, I'm going to circle it. Then I might say, well, if I have some part of the text that I'm reading that I have a question about, then I'm going to put a question mark, and I'm going to use this particular writing utensil for every time that I have a question. I'd pick another one and say, okay, my black ink pen is any time I find something that is surprising to me as the reader. And then I'd use my final pen. This one for me is going to be just a blue ink pen, and that's going to be when I draw an arrow, and maybe I make a connection to another text that I've read. So when we're annotating, we're also, whichever article that we select, we're going to do a paper to go along with it. And this is what it looks like. The first section, we would list the title of the text. So the one that we're using as our example today is this one. It's called Charles Dickens, Life, Work, and Themes. So I've abbreviated that here on this page. And the next two questions say before reading. So I've got to do this before I actually sit down and before I actually read the entire text from beginning to end, every word. The first question says to survey the text. So, survey would mean to just skim through it, just get a general idea about what the article is about. Maybe not read every word, but try and hit the key ones throughout the text. And it says to survey the text and select 5 words or terms that you feel stand out to understanding the importance of the text. So, really important terms that we think might apply to what we're reading. Once we've done this, okay, once we've done this, we have to make a possible sentence. So, we take 3, maybe 2 of the terms we have written in here, and we write a sentence with them that you anticipate or you think might appear in the text. We did something very similar to this earlier this week with the Victorian era material we read. I gave you some terms to use. You made sentences. Then you read the text to see if you are accurate or not. The only difference here is you are the one coming up with the words, not me this time. And then you are doing the same thing you did with that earlier assignment. You are creating a sentence out of some of the terms you used. So to survey the text, here's our text we're going to be working with. Pretty short, just to give you an example, but we'd skim through and we see the name Charles Dickens. We see he was born in England. We see he began schooling at 9. We see in 1824 his father was had his house taken away from him. We see the entire family went to prison. We see that young Charles at 12 was spared the indignity of prison, but he had to go to work in a shoe polish factory, which is pretty rough for a 12-year-old to do. We see he's a sensitive child. We see he had to work in a warehouse, and we see that the conditions he was unable to talk about for years. So as I'm going through, maybe 2 of the key things I see there are that prison was a key word that stood out to me, and 1812 was another one that a date that stood out as I skimmed through or surveyed the text. So once I have those, and I've read the entire article, and I've gathered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I take 2 to 3 of those and try and make a sentence. So I did that with the 2 I have here, prison in 1812, and I'm guessing that in 1812 Dickens' family was forced to go to prison. So I've done my pre-reading now. I'm ready to move on to my during reading, which is the next step. There's 2 things I got to do. One is I have to annotate the text as modeled in class. So let's talk about annotating. All right, we're going to use our writing utensils again. But first, before we ever annotate anything at all, we want to make sure that we read the text because we don't want to just be underlining, circling, writing things that we might think are important without having actually read the text. So let's take a read. This is one paragraph of the article called Charles Dickens' Life, Work, and Themes. And it says Charles Dickens was born in 1812 in Portsmouth, England. He spent his formative years in London and began his schooling at age 9. In 1824, his father John, chronically incompetent in financial matters, was stripped of his house at the behest of anxious creditors. As was the custom, the entire Dickens family was banished to debtor's prison at Marshallay until John Dickens' fiscal problems could be rectified. Young Charles was spared the indignity of prison, but was removed from school and forced into the role of family breadwinner as a menial worker in a shoe polish factory. A sensitive child, gifted with an artist's imagination, Dickens spent an enormously painful period in the stultifying atmosphere of a mid 19th century industrial warehouse, affixing labels to shoe polish canisters. The conditions of factory life were so traumatic that he was unable to talk about it for decades. So there's our text, and now we've got to go back and we're going to go in order. We're going to start with key terms, and we're going to circle any words that we might have not know and would have to look up in order to better understand the word and the text. So I'm reading through, and maybe one of the first words I see that I don't know is this one, rectified. So I would circle it and I would draw an arrow to a margin, and this area would then be used to write a definition. You can Google the word, you can look it up another way, and write your own kind of little definition about what that word means, again, to better understand the word and the text. Maybe another one as I get a couple lines down is breadwinner. And I'm like, gosh, I really don't know what that means. So again, circle it as a key term, draw an arrow, and then give myself some room over here to write a definition. Just a few words down, maybe I don't know the word menial, what that means. So I give myself another arrow, and I'm going to look that one up as well. And I find one more towards the bottom here, affixing. I'm not sure what that means, so I'm going to circle it, draw an arrow, and I'm going to look that word up to discover what that word means. So I've got to go through, and I might not find a word in every paragraph that I don't know. Maybe I'll come across a paragraph where I know all the words, or maybe I'll have two, or maybe I will have a paragraph with four. It really just depends on you as a reader and the text that you're interacting with. The next thing I'm going to use is I'm going to go back to my purple pen, and I'm going to look for anywhere that I might have a question about the text. So I'll start up here, and the first question I have is I noticed that he began schooling at age 9. So I would underline that with my pen, draw an arrow to the margin, and I might simply write why so late, as in why did Charles Dickens start school so late at the age of 9? I get a few lines down and I see that his father had their house taken away. He was stripped of his house. So maybe I'll draw an arrow over here and I say, why was his house taken away? Or why was his house taken? Notice I don't just put a question mark. That doesn't do us much good if we simply write a question mark, because if we come back to this later and we haven't put this question in, we're wondering, well, what exactly was my question here? So make sure it could be 3 words. This one's 5 words. It doesn't have to be long, but enough to help us understand what question you had. Few lines down, we see that Dickens' family was banished to debtor's prison. In fact, the entire family. And so that might be my question. So I draw an arrow up here and I say, why did the whole family have to go? So as you can see, I've come up with three questions along the way. Again, you might have a paragraph where you have two questions or one, maybe a paragraph where you don't have any questions at all. You're only looking for the parts where you do have a question. My next one, as you can see here, is things that I found surprising. So I'm going to go with my black ink pen, and anywhere that stands out, something that surprised me, caught me off guard, maybe go, wow, I didn't expect that, or I didn't realize that. I would underline and again draw a arrow to the margin and talk about what did surprise me. So first thing I come to here is wow, he had to work of all places in a shoe polish factory. Um, what a interesting place to work at 12 years old. And again, I put my exclamation point at the end to show that is a surprising statement. Kind of connected to that, I go down to the bottom here and I notice that he was unable to talk about it for decades. And so I draw an arrow and I'm like, he couldn't discuss it for years. That is really shocking. That must have been horrible that he couldn't talk about for so long, um, based on how he um, experienced the work in that factory. Last thing I gotta do as I annotate is I've got to find and make connections to another text. Now, for your first article, the only thing you'll have to pull previous knowledge from is the green packet that we read in class about the Victorian era. When you get to the second article, you'll have the first and the article and the Victorian article to think about. And when you get to the third article on Monday, you'll have the first two and the Victorian. So the more you read, the more your knowledge expands, the more connections you can make. So in your article, your first article, I might not see as many connections, but I'd hope to see more as you go. One thing I notice here, and it goes back to this family was banished to debtor's prison. I could double that up and go down here and say people were commonly sent to workhouses. And I would go on throughout the rest of the article, um, looking again for connections from something I'd read previously. So you can see we made a lot of effort here in just one paragraph. The reason we're only doing one article a day is because you notice how much work we put into one paragraph. Well, when you look at how much um, there is in an entire article, there are multiple paragraphs, which would take close reading and which would take thinking about each of those parts of annotating. So we're only doing one per day because we want to do it well and we want to take our time and make sure we have found all we can as far as annotating. So there's annotating. Again, we're looking for key terms that we circle. We're looking for questions that we have about the text, things that might have been surprising, or a connection we might make to another text. We'll start with Article 1, and the goal would be of the 6 articles you have to pick from, that you would select two that are longer in length, and I've identified those on Google Classroom, and you would select one that is shorter. Again, those are shown as that in the material on our classroom page. You'd pick one article on the first day, one article on the second day, one article on the third day, and then you'd have your three articles that you have annotated and that you've also um, done some background information on. While we're annotating, we're going to be working on this paper as well. So we've annotated the text. The other thing we want to do is record important notes below about Charles Dickens from the text. So we think about what we've read as we read it, and we're jotting some stuff down. So one thing I might have said is, hey, Charles Dickens was traumatized by factory work. That's something I would want to remember from this particular text that I read. Another is that his family was sent to prison for their debt. So I'd knock out probably, well, in an article, maybe 6 or 7 key pieces of information that I thought were important enough to remember. Then we go down to the bottom here, and we've got our after reading. This is on the front and the back of this final sheet that you do along with your annotating. The first is, what are 2 central ideas that appear in the text? So if somebody was to see you were reading the article you were and say, well, what was that article about? The first 2 things that you tell them, one would go here and one would go here. Just what are 2 important ideas that the author's trying to share with you about the text? The other thing is on the back. They are kind of misnumbered, my mistake. But number 2 says, how would you anticipate these central ideas might have influenced his writing? So he spent time in working in a factory. His family spent time in debtor's prison. How might those central ideas influence his writing? Next, we'd look at and we decide for number 3 which kind of the following text structures most closely describes the organizational structure of the text. So we're trying to figure out what kind of text the author has written. Our choices are descriptive. Does the text describe characteristics of the author? Maybe. So you might see words like for example or such as or maybe the use of adjectives. You see those things, you're probably dealing with a descriptive text. You might be dealing with a chronological or sequence text, which means that the text you've read describes the sequence of events or list of steps. It goes through maybe the order of major events of his life. You're reading a chronological or sequence text if you see words like first, next, last, before, or after, or dates or years that are connected to important things that are written about. And so they go in a chronological order. You might read a compare and contrast text. So maybe what you've read discusses the similarities and differences between Charles Dickens and another author of his time, for example. And we'd be looking for words like or unlike or similarly or on the other hand, almost like a Venn diagram, like what the 2 people have in common or what they have different. The fourth one, maybe it's a cause and effect text, and that explains the events or causes and the results of these events. Words like because, since, this is why, or so. Maybe something talking about what's happened in his life and what caused him to write like that, or choose to write about what he did. And the final type, maybe it's a problem and solution text. Maybe the text describes a problem Dickens had and how that problem was solved. And again, words like because or since or this led to would be clues that say, hey, that's a problem and solution text. Here's where I'm misnumbered. This is actually supposed to be number 4, and the next one's going to be number 5. But what you should do after looking at this chart, we're trying to figure out why the text structure that you selected fits the article. So you've told me it's one of these, okay? Now you're going to tell me why you were led to that belief. And finally, compare and contrast. How is this article different than the first article you read? How is it similar? So when you think about for this your first article, how does it compare to the Victorian era article you read? When you get to the second one, you'll say, "Hey, how is that different than the first Dickens article I read?" And the third, how is it different than the second or the first? So this is all post reading. Once you've done that, you're ready to move on to your second article. But again, this is how we're annotating. We're looking for key terms. We're looking for questions that we have about the text we've read, looking about things that are surprising in the text, and we're looking for any connections we might make to a text that we've read previously.